Welcome back to another edition of Political Breakfast. We are so glad that you are here and listening on WABE. Here today are our strategists, Tharon Johnson and Brian Robinson, along with our producer, Lily Oppenheimer. Hello to all of you.
Hey there.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Yeah, we missed you, and quite a few things dropped while you were gone, Tharon, and I know you were probably alerted to them, but you do know Keisha Lance Bottoms officially says she is running for governor, right?
Yeah, I mean, how can we not know? This is probably the most masterful leading up to a launch to a gubernatorial race as far as utilizing earned media I ever seen. I mean, I teased the former mayor. I said, darn, I said, you got all this coverage about thinking about it. You're going to launch. You're going to probably launch soon. And then boom, she comes out with this video. I actually called her, Lisa, in the video. She said she wakes up every morning. Her grandmother used to tell her to wake up at 6:30. So I intentionally called her at 6:29 to see if she was up last week, and she answered on the second ring. But look, I mean, it's going to be an interesting Democratic primary opportunity for Democrats. We're about to have a very, very public, uncomfortable conversation about who he or she should be the nominee to go on to win this open seat next year in the 2026 gubernatorial race. She's got some accomplishments, but she also has got some questions she's got to answer.
I was going to say uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how?
Well, uncomfortable meaning like who the nominee is going to be, because you got a person who, like Keisha, that has got some accomplishments, some cons. I mean, there's been mixed reactions with her launch. You got Jason Estevez, who's out here raising money. He's young, but people will probably say, hey, you got probably people who've been in the game a little longer. You got Michael Thurman, who I think will be announcing soon that he is going to launch his campaign soon. So he is probably more experienced. He's also a person who's more moderate. And then you got Olu Brown, who's a former pastor, who I think is pastoring a church now. You got Derek Jackson, who's a state representative, who's an Army veteran. And then you got Stacey Abrams, who is still being questioned what would be her level of involvement in this process. It was just announced this week that the Georgia House Democrats are going on a listening tour, and Stacey Abrams is going to be on this listening tour. So not saying that she's running. She hasn't, until she tells the public that she's running. I think we have to assume that she's not. But what role will she play? But the uncomfortable conversation, Lisa, is going to be who is the best person to not only win the primary, but who's the best person to build a winning coalition in Georgia to beat the Republican in 2026. I believe that person has got to be someone who is moderate, someone who can actually fire up the base, but also go out and bring people back to the party and also get votes not just in the metro area, but you got to get votes all over the state.
Yeah, so the process just beginning. But Brian, are Republicans sitting back eating popcorn, watching all this unfold, or not really paying attention at this point?
When it comes to state party elections, we had this conversation a few weeks ago, Lisa, and you asked me that question, are Republicans paying attention? And I said no. On this, they are, because this matters. This is of great import. We're looking because obviously there are some candidates that are going to be stronger than others. There are some who have what I could paint as a legitimate pathway toward winning statewide for the governorship, particularly if the political environment is fertile for Democrats in 2026, as it normally is for the party that's not in the White House. So there are things setting up well for Democrats. So Republicans better be tuned in to what the Democrats are doing. Certainly, to play the other side of what Tharon is saying, I would certainly prefer that they nominate somebody who is more speaking to the Democratic base than speaking to those deciders in Georgia's election, those Kemp Warnock voters. And I'm not sure that Keisha Lance Bottoms, strike that, I am sure, Keisha Lance Bottoms will have a really hard time, even if she masterfully crafts a message that appeals to that broad winning coalition that Tharon is talking about. I'm not sure she's the messenger who makes it believable. There was a show on Political Breakfast a couple of years ago, I guess now it's been more than 3 years ago, where we were heading into what would have been Keisha Lance Bottoms' re-elect year. And Tharon and I are talking, and I'm like, Tharon, what's going on? Here she is. She's the incumbent mayor of Atlanta, a city with all of this wealth, this big business community, and she has no money in her campaign account. She should have been stockpiling for the last 3 years. And it
Mm.
was something, it may have been less than $100,000. And so I was raising a red flag that she wasn't doing the work that you had to do for a reelect. So I was saying it here before, long before President Biden came out and announced her reelection campaign, which she then abandoned 2 weeks later. The city had record high crime, taxes went up. Buckhead tried to secede. She announced her reelect and then backed out. She took on Governor Kemp over COVID closures, which haven't aged well. Her position hasn't aged well. So I think she's got a lot of problems. So are we paying attention? Heck yeah, we are. We would
Mm.
love to see her as the nominee for the Democratic Party.
Well,
So
Michael Thurman's name keeps creeping up, and Tharon, is this strategic? He's taking his
well,
time,
let me
or
answer the questions about Keisha. And let me be very clear here. I think the thing about this show is, we got to be factual. And so this whole notion that Brian just laid out, she did not announce that she was running for re-election and then back out. However, he's correct. Biden did do a fundraiser for her, raise money. So I just want to make sure that our listeners know that she didn't come out and say, "Hey, I'm running for re-election." And then she said, "No, I'm not going to do it." Secondly, is that when I talk about the question she's going to have to answer, Brian just laid it out. I mean, why did you decide not to run for a second term? She don't like to hear the word quit. So, okay, if you don't want to use the word quit, then why did you decide not to run for a second term? And then what makes you think that the people of Georgia would want to see you as governor when you decided not to run for a second term as mayor? Now, I think she's going to answer that question, and she's going to talk about some of her accomplishments too. She's going to talk about giving police the highest raise that they've ever gotten. Now, Brian makes a conversation about crime being high. It was, but let's also be factual and fair on this podcast that everybody was experiencing high crime across the nation. Every single mayor and governor and local leaders were experiencing that. So she's going to have to really answer those questions. And another, let's just go ahead and take it there. I mean, Sequoia Turner was murdered, which I'm sure bothers her a lot. And also, if we're going to talk about Sequoia Turner, let's talk about Rayshard Brooks. We had a uncomfortable conversation on this podcast about whether or not this black man, some can argue he was armed, some can argue he was unarmed, but who was shot in the back by a white police officer at the Atlanta Police Department while he fell asleep and clearly was inebriated on something, right? We don't know, but he got into an altercation with the officer and was shot. So it was just a very uncomfortable time for Atlanta and this country. But I do think we have to give her some type of respect because she is a former mayor and she represented what many would say the second largest or maybe third largest government in the state of Georgia.
and a woman. You know, women, we do everything, right? School, work, play, everything. And she may have just needed time to step back, exhale, and now get back in the game. So you're right. We do need to give her that respect. I wanted to talk about, is this name familiar to you too? And not in the game of politics when it comes to running for office, but Ximena Arias-Cristobal. Are you two familiar with that name?
Yes.
Yes.
Georgia teenager and college student who was stopped by police mistakenly, undocumented, was arrested and taken to ICE and was in custody for 2 weeks, causing a lot of uproar. One Republican politician in particular is speaking out. That's State Representative Casey Carpenter. Brian, pick up the story from there.
Casey Carpenter, of course, somebody I know, somebody Tharon knows. He's a Republican from Dalton, and he's a reliable conservative vote. But the city of Dalton itself is today majority Latino. And Casey is a small business owner, restaurateur, owns a hotel there in Dalton as well. So intimately familiar as state representative and small business with the importance of the Latino workforce in that part of the state. Obviously has a lot of close personal relationships with people in that community. And so he has spoken out to disagree with the administration's approach and is asking that this woman be let alone and able to stay in the country along with her family. And he started a change.org petition over the weekend, actually trying to seek support to keep this young woman and her family in Georgia. So certainly emotionally challenging story, one that shows how difficult this issue is. One thing I've said here is when the immigration enforcement begins, there's going to be heartbreaking stories. And it is a result of many years on a bipartisan basis of allowing a broken system. And there are no easy answers. Obviously, our
Mm.
heart breaks for this young lady, but we're going
Yeah.
to see more of these stories because we have a broken system.
Yeah, she says it's going to change her life forever. The officer involved there and has resigned because, it was mistaken identity, I guess, or actually pulled this particular car over by mistake. But still, she was undocumented. Should that make a difference?
No, because as B Rob has found out recently, I actually do support our men and women in law enforcement, right? It's actually personal to me. And you have most of them who do the right thing on most occasions. But the fact of the matter here is that this woman was mistakenly identified for allegedly making an illegal turn, and she did not put her turn signal on, was arrested, did not believe her story. She tried to comply, but the officer was just adamant. And correct me if I'm wrong, at least I think this officer now has been either reprimanded and maybe has resigned. Is that the case?
Yeah, he resigned. He
Yeah.
resigned over the
So
weekend.
okay. Right. So then you have to go back to the motive. And look, if it was not for dash cam, if it was not for body cam footage, this woman could still be in jail right now because it's her word against this officer's word. But thank you to the police department for actually listening to the woman's attorneys and going back and believing her when she said she did nothing wrong. Now, she was released on bond, got the bond, but she stayed in there too long. And she talked about the deplorable conditions of the jail. No one wants to go to jail. And this could happen to you, Lisa, Brian, me, or Lily,
Oh, for
because an
sure.
officer who mistakenly identified her car as the person doing the turn. And then if he had not had dash cam and body cam, she would still be incarcerated. So that's one part of it. Now, the second part of it is where the story is just making national news is because she is undocumented. She's here unlawfully. So that brings a different aspect to it. But her lawyers argued the point. Those are two separate issues. And so she was released. And yes, she'll have to probably go back and face charges against ICE. But this whole roundup, this whole thing about, you can just identify people because of how they may look, or you get probable cause that was not actually probable or factual to arrest someone. Therein lies the challenge with this sort of ICE roundup that's happening when you have innocent women and people like this young lady who was mistakenly identified for committing a crime, therefore was arrested and had to spend weeks in jail. And yes, Casey Carpenter deserves some credit for speaking out and doing the right thing. All right. But here's the challenge, Lisa. Where are the other Republicans? Where are the other state leaders, state representatives, state senators who are going to follow Representative Carpenter's bravery and going against something that has become a monarch, has become a central theme of his Republican Party that he belongs to? And so what will happen is that if we don't keep talking about this, then it'll just go away. And I guarantee there are probably other people right now either sitting in jail or have experienced something like this that we don't know about. So I really commend this young lady and her family, her attorneys for bringing this up. And I think we need to take a deeper look as a state of what we're doing to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Do you think others will follow suit, Brian?
I do want to clarify, she was not in detention because of a turn signal issue. She was in detention because she's undocumented, and the administration is enforcing the laws on the books and detaining people who are here illegally. That is why she is in detention. We can have a debate about whether or not that should be the policy, but I would argue that if we want a different policy, Congress needs to make a law that says otherwise. That is not the case today. Yes, it's heartbreaking. No one is going to argue that. You can't see this young woman or his family and not feel a lot of sympathy for what is happening there. But the law is the law. And so I don't think you're going to see a lot of Republicans on the state level who aren't members of Congress speaking out on this. I do think you may see Republicans in Congress begin to talk about expanding the definition of the dreamers, the DACA kids. Obviously, this young lady missed that cutoff because Obama said it at 2007 and she arrived here in 2010. So it's a technicality in that regard. But even that, I'm not sure was put into law. That was an order from Obama, not from the law, unless I'm mistaken there. this is something that Congress needs to clarify if this isn't what we want the nation to do.
Some tough conversations being had in Georgia and all across the country. So we want to wish the veterans a happy belated Memorial Day. And we'll check in next week and talk some more politics then.
Thanks, Lisa. Have a good week.
Thank you.